Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. I'm always telling people to watch out for the forcing moves. The forcing moves are checks, captures, and threats. For instance, I tell people that hope chess is when you make a move and you don't look at all the important or dangerous checks, captures, and threats that your opponent can make on the next move, and make sure that you can make them safely on your next move. Otherwise, he'll make something like an unstoppable threat, and then it's too late. For instance, in the position I have in front of me here, if black says, oh, that pawn on b5 isn't guarded, and plays queen takes b5, and white plays queen h6, that's a mate threat on g7, but it's more than just a mate threat. It's an unstoppable mate threat. And unstoppable threats, of course, can't be stopped. So therefore, you could think as long as you want now. You could be Magnus Carlsen or Stockfish 14.1. It won't help you. It's going to be a loss for black. So if you play hope chess and you let him make such a threat, then you're just going to lose the game. Now, everybody recognizes this kind of threat, but the question comes up, what is a threat in general and how do you measure it? How do you recognize them? I realize that when I say look for your opponent's checks, captures, and threats, you can't really look for every single one because a lot of them are so bad or so harmless or so silly that it's not really worth your time to enunciate. And you could also look for threats of threats of threats that'll happen 5 moves from now, and that may be a big waste of time too. So what I tell people is, yes, I say look for all his checks, captures, and threats, but I really mean all the pertinent or dangerous ones. But I thought today we'd just look at the word threat. When I ask my students, what's a threat? Please define the word threat. By far, most of them cannot do it. Some of them get close to what is kind of the right idea, and I think certainly most of them understand what the right idea is. They just can't put it into words. So let me put it into words right now for you. A threat is a move that, if not stopped, on the next move will do something good for the person making the threat. Okay? And when I say something good, unlike tactics which involve winning material and checkmate, threats don't have to threaten a tactic. Threats could threaten something good like control of a file, messing up your opponent's pawn structure, getting an outpost for your knight, exposing your opponent's king. Anything good for you can be a threat. Some threats you can ignore and you could let them do whatever they're going to do, like mess up your pawns, and then you could say, all right, well, that was good for him, but in return I got a tempo to ignore him, and with that tempo I did something good for me. So you're always trading these things off. So let's go back to this position that we looked at before, where we look at our checks, captures, and threats. Now, can a check also be a threat? Well, okay, it can. Suppose this wasn't mate here. Let's put the pawn on h5 instead of h7. And we look at this move, queen to c8 check. This is a check, but it's also a threat. It's a threat to take the rook on a8. If black does king h7, then we take the rook on a8. So queen c8 check is not only a check, but it's also a threat. Generally, when a check or a capture is also a threat, then we don't list it separately as a threat. For instance, let's put the pawn back on h7, and let's make a recapture here. Let's put a rook over here, and we'll put a rook over here, and we'll put the queen over here. Let's say it's black's turn, and let's make it black's turn here. And black plays rook takes d1. That's a capture. White's move queen takes d1 is a capture, but it's also a threat to mate in 2 on the back rank. Now this is a defensible threat. Black has several moves that can stop queen d8 check, but the capture is also a threat. So a check could be a threat, a capture could be a threat, but we don't separately look for them that way. We usually say if you found all your checks and captures, which are very well defined, everybody understands what a check is, everybody understands what a capture is. If the threat or capture also happens, if the check or capture also happens to be a threat, we usually don't characterize it as a threat, although certainly it can be. Like in this case, recapturing on d1 is a very, very powerful threat, a very easily met threat, but very powerful one. Let's go back to our original position where there's a rook on a8 and there's a rook off the board, and there's a queen on c1. If I said to you, take 2 minutes now and see if you can find all of white's threats. Let's say you're black, and let's go back a move. And black is looking at this position, and he's saying to himself, if I take this pawn, what are all of white's checks, captures, and threats? And instead of looking for all the dangerous ones, let's say you just have to say, what are all the threats that white has? Every single threat. Okay, and we won't include the checks and captures, so we won't include queen c8 check as a threat to win the rook. We're just looking for moves that are threats, but not checks and captures in this position. Okay, well, you could stop the video and do this, and I will assume that you have if you already wanted to. But let's take a look. In this position, obviously queen h6, which is the unstoppable threat in mate in 1, is the #1 threat. But actually, white has many, 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 many threats that he can play. All right, so let's start looking at some of them. White could play a4 and threaten the queen. Well, you might say, you know, why would he do that? He could just take the pawn. And the answer is, well, I didn't say you're looking for threats that are good moves. I'm just saying that you're looking for threats. Okay? If you filter out what's a good move and what's a bad move, and you don't list what's threats, then sometimes you make quiescence errors and you filter out moves that you shouldn't actually filter out. This is a main reason why good players often see threats or checks, captures, threats the weaker players filter out. The weaker player sees the move, but they reject it right away as being no good. But if it's a good sacrifice, you don't want to do that. So for right now, we're not going to filter anything out. We're not going to filter out moves that are bad or easily met. We're just going to say that it's a threat. Well, a4 is a threat. How do we know it's a threat? Because if black does nothing and says, I pass, white can play a takes b5 and win the queen. So that's a threat. But that means all these other moves that look silly are threats too. For instance, queen to b1 is a threat. Why is it a threat? Because if black does nothing, I'll win his queen. Why would I do that? Well, I wouldn't. He'll take my queen, queen takes b1, but that doesn't make it a threat. It just makes it a bad move that also happens to be a threat. We have lots of moves in this category. Queen to b2 is the same kind of move. Queen to c4 is the same kind of move. Queen to c5 is the same kind of move. Queen to f1 is the same kind of move. Queen to c6 is the same kind of move. Again, is that a move you'd be worried about if you were black? Of course not. But if black says, no, I pass, does white have a threat? Can white do something good on the next move? Sure, queen takes b5. But if it's black's move and black says, well, I'm not worried about that, I'll just play b takes c6 or queen takes c6, well, of course you would. But that doesn't mean queen c6 can't be characterized as a threat. It's simply characterized as a terrible move and a threat. Get the idea? Is e6 a threat? If you thought e6 was a threat, then we're in the gray area. Because e6 might be good for white. You could say if black does nothing and white plays e6 here, then if black takes, white gets a dangerous passed pawn and he isolates his pawn. But actually, black's winning a pawn. And now, because this rank is open, if white plays something like queen h6 now, black's happy that he can now get to that g7 square. So I would say that e6 in this position is not a threat for white, but it's certainly the kind of move you'd look at to see whether you're really threatening anything. Now, could you make a move that threatens to threaten? You could say, well, queen d6 is a threat because it threatens to go to h6 and then unstoppable mate. Well, okay, that's a threat to threaten, and threats to threaten can sometimes be very dangerous if the thing that you're going to threaten on the next move can't be stopped, and here it can't be stopped. But here black could play moves that would stop the mate with the extra tempo. He could play queen e8, for instance, and now after queen h6, queen f8 stops the mate. Or if white plays queen d2 to threaten, queen h6, I know, we could have played it right away. King h8, then queen h6, and then rook g8. Again, no checkmate here. So queen d6 is not really a threat. It's a threat to threaten, but threats to threaten, well, almost every move on the board eventually could be threats to threaten. I mean, if we give it enough nth threats, then we're really not looking for moves like that. We're really looking for moves that right away do something on the next move. Now, when people are playing long-term things, like for instance, let's take all the pieces off the board here for a second. And let's say white has a 3-on-2 majority here. And black's king is currently like on the H file. And white plays A4. Well, this is not a direct threat, but it is a threat to threaten, to threaten, to threaten, which is if black sits here and does nothing and just keeps moving his king back and forth, then eventually white can play something like this, and now he has a direct threat to create a passed pawn and get a queen. So here, A4 is not a direct threat, but it is a threat to make a threat to make a threat, and eventually it'll force black's king over to the queen side to defend. So this is an example where the threat's not really on the next move, but you have to pay strong attention to what he's trying to do here, because even though the move isn't directly a threat, the idea eventually becomes a threat to create the passed pawn. So there's a lot of gray area here. If you say to me, is A4 a threat? You know, and you catch me off guard, I might say, well, it's not a threat on this move, but yeah, it's a threat to eventually get a passed pawn. The word being eventually. That's different than the position we just looked at here, where I wouldn't quite characterize, whoops, wrong typo there. I wouldn't quite characterize queen to D2 as the same type of move as A4 was in the position that we just looked at. All right, let's do another little quizzy thing. Let's pull up, I think it's number 77 in my library here. Okay, number 77. Okay, this is a tactic, so we're going to do two things. We're going to do the tactic, and then we're going to do the little same threat thing. So as a fun thing, this is from John Bain's Chess Tactics for Students. It's position number 225, I think, with maybe the colors reversed. And he has it as black to play and win because the colors are reversed, but now I did it this way with white to play and win. So the question is, white to play and win, what should you do? All right, well, again, you can stop the video and do the puzzle. All right, this is in the chapter on, well, it could be on the chapter under skewers. It could be on the chapter under removal of the guard. I think he has it under skewers, if I remember correctly. But the right answer, again, you're looking for your checks, captures, and threats. You're looking for one that'll win the game. If you check him with rook to D2 check, he can just move the king over to C8 and you're not getting anywhere. If you look for a capture, rook bishop takes F6. He plays bishop F6 and you can't play rook E8 mate because the rook on F8 guards the mate. And he doesn't have to play bishop F6. He could play G takes F6. So the right answer is to sacrifice the exchange. John Bain has a lot of these problems where he shows you how to set things up. You play rook takes E7. You're up a piece. If he tries to take back with the king, you skewer him with bishop to B4 check. And now this is where it's removal of the guard, because the king would love to move and guard the rook, but the bishop on B5 is taking away the only square the king can go to that would guard the rook square, and putting the pawn on C5 in the way just delays the inevitable. He'll just take it off, bishop takes C5 check. So if you move the king out of the way, whether you go up to E6 or back to D8, doesn't matter. Bishop takes F8. And white started out by sacrificing a rook for a bishop, but it was a pseudo-sacrifice, because if he takes it, then on the next move we win an entire rook with the check, and we end up, when the smoke clears, being up a piece. This is the kind of position that people rated 12, 13, 14, 1500 get in these puzzle books quite easily, and then in the games they miss them almost every time, because they look at the position and they make quiescence errors, and they say, hey, rook takes E7, I can't do that, he'll just take with the king, and I lose material. In a puzzle book, they would say, what do I need to do to win the game? And gee, maybe rook takes E7, king takes E7 will do something. Let's look further. In a game, stronger players don't make the mistake. In a game, stronger players say, suppose I play rook takes E7, king takes E7. Is that worth investigating further? Do I have any other checks, captures, or threats that would make it worth my while? Yes, I've got that move bishop B4 check. That's a skewer, so I'll at least get the exchange back. Oh, look at that. He can't even guard the rook. Oh, I'm actually winning something. Oh, okay, let's investigate that further. And they would. They would investigate it further. For instance, after rook takes E7, they would look at, what if he plays the Zwischenzug C6? Why is that a good move? Well, if white now just saves the bishop, and now black takes the rook, then after bishop checks, he can guard the rook, and now he doesn't end up losing anything after bishop takes, king takes. Well, does that save the game and make this problem a cook where it really isn't a win? No, it isn't, because a good player would say, well, if he plays c6 and gives me time, then I could play rook takes b7, threatening to skewer the rook and the king. Now he's got two possibilities. If he takes the bishop, I skewer him, and if he guards the rook, I still have this other skewer here with bishop here check, and I end up winning a whole rook, and I'm going to be a rook ahead. On the other hand, if he again plays his Zwischenzug and plays king here, I could move my rook over to a7 and keep doing that, but better is to just simply play bishop takes c6, and now I'm guarding my rook, and I took off that knight, and he never took anything back, so I ended up winning a knight and two pawns. So that's the full analysis of doing this correctly. Rook takes e7. Possibility number one is he takes, and then you check. If he puts the pawn in the way, it doesn't change. If he moves the king up or back, we take the rook. Possibility number two, which is the more, human kind of thing for defense, is to try to stop that with c6. Then we simply have to see that rook takes b7 will win. Now, is rook takes b7 the only winning move here? No, there's probably other moves that win. Probably bishop takes f6, taking another piece and guarding the rook is probably enough to win. But rook takes b7 is a pretty clear win. If he takes the bishop, you check. If he tries to guard the rook, you check him away. And as we just saw, if he attacks the rook again, we can just take the pawn, and we're up a piece and two pawns here. All right, now we're going to do our little threat thing. We've now seen the answer to the puzzle, white to play and win, but now I'm going to ask you, what are all of white's threats? It's white's move, and we're looking for moves that are threats. All right, again, take into account what we said before. A threat doesn't have to be a good move. A threat just has to do something good for you on the next move if he doesn't do anything. And again, we're going to eliminate all the checks and captures. So we're not going to look at rook d2 check, bishop takes f6, rook takes e7. Those are checks and captures. If they happen to also be threats, that's great, but we're going to throw them off the list. So at this point, you can pause the video and look for all the look for all the threats that white can make on the next move. All right, I assume you've done that, and if you wanted to follow along with the video, you're going to do that. So what are some of the threats he could make here? Okay, well, we could threaten the bishop on e7 again. We could play bishop to b4. If black does nothing, I'll play bishop takes e7 check, and then I'll take the rook. Again, is this a very good move? No, it's not, because if he takes my bishop, I don't have any mate on e8. So bishop b4 is a terrible move, but it's a distinct threat. All right, what else could white play that's a threat? Well, along the same lines, white could play bishop c6. That threatens to take the pawn on b7. Again, he's got an easy defense. He could take me. It's a silly move, but it's a threat. Same thing for bishop a6. Bishop a6 threatens to take the pawn on b7. Okay, so now we see three threats: bishop b4, bishop c6, bishop a6. Does white have other threats? Well, yes. He could play bishop a5. And you might say, well, that doesn't threaten anything because the pawn on c7 is guarded. And the answer is, well, suppose black passes and doesn't make any move here. Then I'm threatening the overworked king. The king can't guard the bishop and the pawn. So the threat, let's make it white's move, is to play bishop takes check. And if he takes back, I play rook takes check, and I win a pawn. So I'm threatening to win a pawn with bishop a5. All right, let's put the bishop back on c3. Well, if bishop a5 is a threat, then bishop e5 is also a threat. I'm threatening to do the exact same thing. If black doesn't do anything, I'm going to play bishop takes c7, king takes c7, rook takes e7 check, and I win a pawn. Now, for those of you that found the move g4, g4 is not really a threat because if black does nothing, then white doesn't have any wonderful things he can do on the next move. Could he push the pawn again and drive the knight away and go after the pawn on g7? Yes. So does that really work? Because after g4, g5, the knight could go up to h5 and guard the pawn on g7. So you might say you're trying to threat make a threat to threaten, but g4 really isn't a threat. Is it a threat to make a threat? Well, even that is arguable. So g4 would not be on the list. Do you see the difference? Because if I play g4 and black says I pass, I really don't have anything tremendously great I can do to his position. Okay? So g4, we're starting to get there where it's, under consideration. But I really wouldn't put that on the list. All right, do we have anything else that we missed? Is a5 a threat? Is it threatening to play like a6 and then break up his pawns and try to get a passed pawn? I don't think so. I don't think a5 is a threat. Ditto for b4. Maybe we could get an outside majority 2-on-1 here on the A and B file. I don't see that really as being a threat. Rook to c2. Am I threatening to play bishop f6 or something? I don't think so. Bishop d3. Am I threatening to play bishop takes f6 followed by bishop h7? I guess we could look at that. Bishop d3, black passes. Now it's my turn. I can't take the pawn because the knight takes it. So am I threatening to play this move followed by this move? And the answer is, well, I'm not sure that's really a threat. What if he goes here? Would I really be happy about doing this? Because if now white plays something like h4, then rook h8. If h5, just rook takes, pawn takes, and I lost a piece. So I don't think bishop d3 threatens to play bishop takes f6 followed by bishop h7. It's close again. It's the kind of thing we'd look at. But is bishop d3 really deserve to be on the threat list? I kind of think no. So the big threats here are bishop to b4, threatening to win the bishop with rook takes e7, or bishop takes e7, bishop c6, threatening bishop takes b7, bishop a6, threatening bishop b7, bishop a5, threatening bishop c7 check. Now, these defenses all have threats. You could say, well, why is that a threat? He can defend it. Well, just because somebody can defend a threat, as we said earlier in the video, that doesn't mean it's not a threat. It just means it may be a silly thing. We see weak players making silly threats all the time. I always tell people, when you're a beginner and you make silly threats, and, like let's say you attack his queen with your bishop with the idea that maybe he won't see it. So let's say we have two beginners playing, and the game opens up d4, e6. Then beginners play like bishop g5 and say, oh, I'm attacking his queen. I bet he won't see it. Is this hope chess because you're hoping he won't see it? Well, that's not my definition of hope chess, but it's certainly a reasonable definition of hope chess, and people have given me, credit for this kind of thing, even though that's not what I originally meant. But bishop g5, are you hoping he won't see that he could just take the bishop, and you're hoping, therefore, he'll let you take the queen by playing a move like a6? Well, okay, this was a threat. It was a very, very big threat, but it's also a very silly threat. Now, you might say, well, I wouldn't do stuff like that. Well, okay, but as you get better, people still make silly threats, and they figure, well, that's the way to win the game. I'll make silly threats, maybe not this silly. Let me give you an example. Suppose we're in a gioco piano. Bishop c4, bishop c5, and bishop c5. And let's say white plays castle, and black plays knight g5. And now white says, oh, just like in the two knights defense, I can play knight to g5. And now I'm threatening both bishop f7 check and knight takes f7. That's a really good threat. Well, the problem is black has easy defenses. For instance, suppose he just castles. Well, I've seen people in this position playing knight takes f7, carrying out their, quote, threat. Rook takes f7, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and they say, aha, I've exposed black's king. My king is safe, his king is up on the second rank, his pawn is going around his king. And if we look at Reinfeld numbers say, I gave up a bishop and a knight, 3 and 3, I got a rook and a pawn, 5 and 1. So the material is even, but his king is exposed. This is really good for me. Well, Mr. Stockfish, what would you say to people who say that carrying out that, quote, threat was a good idea? How would you evaluate this position? Mr. Stockfish says, as you can see the evaluation here under the board, black is ahead by 3.3 pawns, almost 3.5 pawn advantage already. So beginners think this position is good for white because you've traded 6 for 6 and the black king is exposed. Stockfish says, well, those Reinfeld numbers aren't very good. And no, black's king is in no danger. In fact, white's the one who's in all kinds of danger. And white's ahead by 3.6. This is evaluation. So the evaluation is black is winning fairly easily, up about 3.7 pawns now at 25 ply. So what we can conclude from this is that when white played knight to after castles knight f6, when white played knight g5, this was a threat, but this is a pretty silly threat because after black castles, neither knight takes pawn or bishop takes f7 check are any good. And if that's true, then what's the knight doing on g5? He's just wasting time where he could have been developing. And you could see if white doesn't play knight takes f7 here, he's lost his advantage in big time. Black's already ahead by 0.6. Now it's down to 0.4 because white has made that silly move knight g5. So that's an example of a silly threat. You don't want to make silly threats. Any video like this one on defining threats should tell you if you're going to make a threat, you want to make a threat that if your opponent sees the threat and meets the threat, which you have to assume, that it doesn't actually hurt your position. You have to keep your position at least still. Ideally, you want threats that actually gain something. For instance, let's look at the center counter. e4, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3. Well, that's a threat on the queen, and you might say, well, it's kind of a silly threat. Do you really think he's going to leave the queen there? And the answer is no. You understand he's not. But that's the point. You want him to move the queen twice in the opening so that you can bring out more pieces while he's spending time moving the queen a couple times. I call this idea of attacking something with something worth less, AWL, attack with something worth less. I have a video on that. And if in the opening, if you can attack with something worth less and get development out of it while your opponent doesn't get development, he has to waste time defending against the AWL, then the term that everybody uses for this is called winning a tempo. Why is it winning a tempo? Because white's taking the tempo with his threat to do something positive, and black, unlike the previous example where black could do something positive in castle and meet the threat and make it look silly, here black can't make the threat look silly. He just has to move the queen, which makes the threat reasonable. If black had played queen to c5, now the other AWL, knight a4, that's no longer winning a tempo. It is a threat. It's a big threat to win the queen. But now when he saves the queen, he's going to be attacking your knight, and your knight's on a worse square. So you spent a tempo putting your knight on a worse square just to force the queen to move to a more neutral square. So now knight a4 is much more like the knight g5 was in the previous example. So there's good threats and there's bad threats. There's still silly threats. There's threats that are easily met. There's threats that are not so easily met. But there's threats that are easily met, like this one, which are perfectly good threats. And there's threats like in the previous example that are silly threats that are also easily met. But when they meet them, it actually helps them, because here, castles is the kind of move black wanted to play anyway. And this knight is going from a good square to a somewhat inferior square in this case. And that's why the evaluation drops so much when you play that move. Okay, hope you enjoyed today's video on threats. It was basic, but actually it was very powerful. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Better yet, tell your friends about Dan Heisman Chess. Let's pass the word. Let's see if we can get up to 5,000 subscribers. And if you liked the video, do that too. See you next time. Bye.